In turning now to the question of why the idea of human rights has emerged as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, as is stated in the preamble to the Universal Declaration, and perhaps also the question of where, as in, where do human rights principles come from? In approaching these questions, we will not be able to arrive at one definitive answer. But I'd like to introduce 3 or 4 different perspectives on the central issues that may help us to think about and understand what's at stake, and also perhaps to understand where certain expressions of human rights skepticism are coming from. Before turning to this, I'd like to make one more important observation. The process of establishing an international human rights architecture has from the start involved many different stakeholders and has been driven by a broad range of differently positioned actors. These include statesmen and women, diplomats, politicians, intellectuals, opinion leaders, but also ordinary people, people fighting for justice in the society, in the settings in which they live, and social movements who've been reinforcing, protecting and supporting such claims. We've talked already about the way in which representatives of newly liberated former colonies played an important role in establishing the human rights agenda of the 1960s, and in particular establishing the principle of a right to self-determination as foundational to all other human rights. The civil rights movement became prominent and established a wide sense of opposition to discrimination, racial discrimination and unequal treatment in society, and the global feminist movement or women's rights movement similarly has established core principles about equal treatment and opposition to gender-based discrimination and violence. Social movements similarly have focused attention on the importance of children's rights, rights of persons living with disabilities, rights of migrant workers, similarly rights of indigenous people, just to make a few examples. In all of these cases, many stakeholders have come together, as we said, and different ideas, different aspirations have clashed and crystallized in the form of agreed new standards. The Commission on Human Rights, which met annually from the time of the formation of the United Nations until 2005, when it was replaced by the Human Rights Council, was a marketplace, a place where different people met and where different actors met and argued and made claims and shared ideas and eventually reached certain points of agreement about a shared agenda and way forward in relation to human rights. The Vienna Conference on Human Rights in 1993 similarly was an occasion for the international community, actors positioned at many, many different levels, to come together and set a joint agenda forward-looking for a new era. The point I'm trying to emphasize is that human rights don't have one source of origin, one particular meaning. They're part of a dynamic process related to governance and international coexistence in the current era. Now, to turn to the question of why, as I said, I'd like to introduce 3 or 4 complementary perspectives. The first looks at the value base of human rights. One could say it has to do with the positive affirmation of certain values as shared by members of different civilizations, different cultures, different religious traditions, and held to be central to all of humanity in the contemporary era. Examples of this could be values having to do with justice, solidarity, compassion, equality, respect. But at the heart of all of them, perhaps, lies a shared affirmation of the idea of the inherent dignity of the human person. What does this mean? This means that human beings deserve to be treated not just as a means for the ends of others, not just as an instrument or tool we can use for particular other objectives, but as inherently valuable, as an end in one's own right. This is reflected in human rights standards having to do with the integrity of the human person, in particular the physical integrity of the human person, the prohibition against torture, ill treatment, arbitrary imprisonment, or for that matter, arbitrary killing. It's also reflected in a broad range of freedoms, liberties, the freedom to think for oneself, form one's own opinions, and express one's ideas and opinions, the freedom to decide what kind of relationships one wants to form, association with others, political associations, choice of how one wants to live one's family life, for example. Also, freedoms to participate in the cultural and political affairs of the community and nation that one is part of. Freedom of movement. All of these freedoms affirm the inherent dignity of the human person. Interestingly, one can also see a reflection on this in economic, social, and cultural rights, which not often are linked or not often thought about in the same way. Economic, social, and cultural rights are fundamentally about empowering people to take charge of their own affairs, to take charge of their own life, and be active participants in the society that surrounds them. This is true of the right, clearly, to education, for example, but also rights such as the right to health, the right to food, and the right to work, the right to shelter. As we noted, thoughts related to the inherent dignity of the human person can be found in one form or another in all great cultural and religious traditions of the world. So they mark an important common focal point for the international human rights framework. That said, there are also points of contention. Sometimes the values enshrined in human rights are seen to be out of sync with the values of particular cultural or religious traditions. This is true, for example, in some cases, of concepts of what are the requirements of justice, related, for example, to ambiguities about the legitimacy of death penalty. Similarly, issues having to do with the role of religion in society, in the public sphere, and the alleged secularism of international human rights is sometimes linked with a potential value conflict. Same is true of cultural norms defining gender relations, for example, in particular issues related to sexual orientation, and also the potential clash between the human rights framework and certain established cultural and traditional practices. All of this said, there's a clear sense, I think the glass is more half full than half empty, as it were, when it comes to articulating a common global value base. The human rights framework does capture some very important elements.